Dead America, El Paso, Creeping Death, Part 6. Dead America, the Second Month. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Leon sat at the satellite computer, staring intently at a zoomed-out view of Fabens. The town was on the far left side of the screen, with the interstate running through the middle, stretching to the right. About 3/4 of the way across was a dark black line that slowly moved towards them.
"Not going to be long now, is it?"
Ethel asked from behind him. Leon looked up at her, and she handed him a fresh mug of steaming coffee. He gently shook his head. The line on the screen was the zombie horde, and it marched towards them, with nothing else they could do to slow it down. Everything that they had thrown at the walking corpses did virtually nothing to them, outside of thinning the numbers a little bit. Not that facing 950,000 instead of 1,000,000 really changed much in the grand scheme of things. "Don't worry, Ethel, we're going to be okay," he murmured. She let out a laugh, shaking her head, and he wrinkled his nose, looking back up at her. "Not buying it?" he asked. She wagged a finger at him.
"With that level of conviction, you couldn't sell a fire hose spouting out water to someone whose home is on fire," she quipped.
"Ouch," he said, wincing playfully. She winked at him.
"Truth hurts, big boy,"
she said, and patted his shoulder. He smiled and then turned back to the screen before the satellite went out of range. He did some quick measurements and math before tossing his pen down with a grunt, letting out a long, frustrated sigh.
"Drink your coffee,"
Ethel quipped from across the room.
"It'll help."
He scrubbed his hands down his face. "You're too good for me, Ethel," he called back.
"I know,"
she replied with another wink.
"But you're my sympathy project, so I power through it."
He chuckled and followed her instructions, lifting the mug to his lips and taking a long sip. He zoomed in tightly on the horde, watching the front edge of it move across his screen in their direction. He drank and watched, until the satellite moved out of range and flickered off. Leon stared at the blank screen, the reality of what was coming to knock on their doorstep a little too much to bear. His momentary hypnosis was broken when the door to the command center opened. Trenton, Clara, and Sparks entered, pausing when he startled visibly, swiveling his chair around to face them. "You all right there?" Trenton asked gently. "Huh?" Leon replied dumbly, and then shook his head. "Yeah, sorry, just in deep thought." Sparks looked past him at the screen reading, "Satellite is out of range."
"I'm assuming that the horde didn't spontaneously turn around?" she asked dryly.
"Nah, our luck isn't quite that good," he replied with a dark laugh. Ethel walked over with a tray of mugs, and everyone nodded appreciatively as they took their own hot cup.
"Would anybody else be surprised if Ethel had a fresh pot of coffee for that horde when it gets here?"
Clara joked before she took a slurp of her brew. Trenton barked a laugh. "Probably the reason they're headed this way," he suggested. "It always smells so good, they just can't resist it." Sparks took a step towards Leon, face sobering.
"How much time do we have?"
she asked. "Maybe 6 hours," he replied. "They should be here just after sundown."
"That gives us time to finish up some last-minute defenses on the eastern perimeter of town,"
Clara piped up. Leon nodded, swiveling to face her as he took a sip of his coffee. "How are they coming?" he asked.
"We have a line of vehicles stretching out over the better part of a mile along the interstate," she explained, motioning with her hand. "We're putting in some ditches to trip them up. It's nothing major, but it should be able to handle a few stragglers."
"We also have a car blockade on the interstate ramps," Trenton added. "But it's probably not going to do much good. Seems like whenever those things see a road, they wander up it until the mass behind them gives a good enough push to keep them going forward." "How good are the exit barricades?" Leon asked. Trenton tilted his head back and forth. We have the cars triple stacked, so it should do okay with stopping the front waves, he replied. But with that kind of force behind them, it won't take long to push through them. I mean, it is what it is, Leon replied with a shrug. Anything that can slow them down is helpful, but honestly, I think we've done everything we can do.
Well, we still have 6 hours, Clara replied, nodding sharply. Surely we can do a bit more. We are, Sparks cut in. Everybody in town that isn't digging ditches is making more spikes for the drainage ditch. It's taken a while for that wall of spikes to come together, but it's looking quite formidable.
Leon nodded and checked his watch. Okay, we'll give that about 2 more hours before we start moving people to the school, he instructed. If they aren't very mobile, go ahead and get them up to the 2nd floor. Last thing we want is to have to carry people up the stairs while fighting those things.
We've managed to pull together 10 radios that still have enough of a charge to be useful, Sparks continued. We just need to figure out where to put them.
Leon set his empty mug on the desk. 1 in every safe house, and the school to be sure, he said.
I'm not going to be on comm unless there is a major problem, Sparks admitted, but I'm going to need one at the Humdinger.
Trenton raised a hand. The interstate scout should have one too, he said. We're going to need to know when the horde has passed.
Or if we're attracting more company than we anticipated, Clara added.
Trenton let out a deep whoosh of breath. Gotta love that optimism, he muttered.
Pretty sure that went out the window a month or so ago, she replied with a shrug.
As if on cue, the air horn went off from the interstate watch, signaling approaching vehicles. Leon got to his feet. I was just beginning to wonder if Rodriguez was going to show up today, he said. Everyone moved outside, standing in the parking lot of the command center, sipping their coffees as 3 vehicles pulled up. As soon as they stopped, Rodriguez leapt out of the lead SUV. Did anybody see where Angel's vehicle went? He bellowed immediately as the others poured out. Where the hell is he? Javier approached from the rear vehicle.
Sir, he went to the north when we came off of the interstate, he called. I don't know why he would, though.
Go and get him now, Rodriguez demanded. Javier's brow furrowed, and he chewed his lip nervously.
Sir, he trailed off, swallowing hard, I don't think that...
Your thoughts are irrelevant, Rodriguez cut in firmly. Do as you are told, or you are going to know what my thoughts are, and I promise you that you will not enjoy it. Javier nodded jerkily, turning tail and scurrying back to his SUV. Within seconds he turned around and peeled off towards the north. Good to see you, Rodriguez, Leon declared with a little wave. Thank you for coming. The cartel member turned and sighed, offering a thin smile. My apologies for being late, he said. Diego wasn't pleased about me wanting to come out today, but I managed to convince him. Doesn't seem like Angel is too happy about being out here either, Leon mused. Well, I remembered you saying you wanted him to set up one of the houses for detonation, Rodriguez explained. Knowing he could destroy part of this town got him motivated. Leon played along, sensing that the cartel member was up to something. Since it would serve no purpose to cause an explosion in town, he nodded approvingly. Well, when he gets here, you can take him to the hospital on the edge of town, he said. There is a house a couple of blocks down from it that will be perfect. It's alone on the corner with bright blue shutters. Can't miss it. Before Rodriguez could respond, 2 SUVs came screaming towards them, pulling up to the rear of the lot. Angel Rivas strutted up to them, sneering. All right, where is this house that needs destroying? He demanded. I don't want to be here any longer than I need to. Get your gear, and we'll start walking to it, Rodriguez replied. Angel snapped his fingers, and one of his lackeys ran back to the vehicle. He returned a moment later with 2 large heavy canvas bags, struggling to move under the weight of them. Lead on, the younger Rivas said. Leon will give you your assignments, Rodriguez barked to the other men. Do whatever they need done. Meet back here in 4 hours. If Angel and I aren't back from the house yet, you are to head out without us, understood? The cartel members nodded, turning towards Leon with a modicum of politeness. The man in question nodded to Rodriguez. Appreciate that, he said. Horde should be here in 6, so that gives you guys a big enough window to get out. One thing before I go, Rodriguez said, raising a finger. Do you have any food? We have some lunch being cooked up as we speak, Leon replied with a smile. I'll send someone your way in, say, 30 minutes with some goodies. Rodriguez nodded. That will be fine, thank you, he replied, and headed off towards the south end of town, with Angel and his lackey shambling after them. Leon waved Sparks over and leaned close. Would you mind taking our guests some appropriate treats? He asked softly. She nodded. I have just the thing, she replied, and walked away, leaving Leon to turn to the cartel members standing there awaiting instructions. Okay, I need 2 groups, he said loudly. One is going to follow Clara to start digging trenches. The rest of you will be with Trenton here making defensive stakes. Pick what you want to do, and we'll get it going. The men looked around at each other, muttering back and forth before breaking into 2 groups. Leon turned to Trenton and Clara, keeping his voice low as the men organized themselves. Keep them occupied, and don't let anyone leave, he murmured. The duo nodded sharply and broke off to take control of their groups. Meanwhile, Sparks made her way towards the house by the hospital after making a pit stop at her own residence. She slung a small black canvas bag over her shoulder and looked around as she strolled. There was nobody around for blocks. Everyone in town was either being moved to the school or working furiously on the town defenses. She reached the door she needed and knocked. "Come in," somebody called from inside. As she entered, she spotted Angel in the living room, rigging explosives on the wall. Rodriguez stood in the kitchen with the other cartel member, both men awaiting instructions from the younger Rivas, since he was the one who knew what he was doing. Angel leaned back and glanced at the door, shooting Sparks a smirk. "It's about time. I'm starving," he drawled, and tossed down his screwdriver, sauntering towards her like a lion on the prowl. "Oh, you're a feisty one," he purred when he reached her. "Taming you is going to be a challenge, but quite a fun one." Sparks raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, and then rolled her eyes. Angel snarled, drawing his knife and flipping it around a few times before holding it up to her face. "You keep that up, and I'll make you real pretty," he growled. "Like your friend here in town, only I'll make sure everyone can see it, so they know you're mine." She held his gaze, asking simply, "Rodriguez?" Angel burst out laughing. "No, I thought you were a tough one," he teased, sneering. "Now you're asking a big old man to protect you? I bet that just eats you up inside knowing you can't do anything to me without risking this town." He glanced at Rodriguez. "So, what do you say, huh? You going to tell me to back off?" Rodriguez stared straight into Angel's eyes, gaze intense. "Sparks," he said. "Do it." Angel's face whipped back to face the redhead, finding her smiling. Without hesitation, Sparks struck him in the throat, sending him staggering backwards. He tried to swing his knife, but she caught his wrist and snapped it like a twig. His knife clattered to the floor as he gasped for air, face contorted as if he'd be screaming in pain if he could. In the kitchen, Angel's lackey's eyes widened at the attack on his boss. He took a step forward to join the fight, but Rodriguez stabbed him in the throat. A simple backhanded jab from the side. The lackey fell to the ground, surprise in his eyes at the betrayal, holding onto the wound in a failing attempt to stop the blood from spurting out. His strength faded quickly as he went limp, blood pooling beneath him. Angel regained his footing a bit, using his good arm to throw a punch towards Sparks. She ducked back to avoid it before lunging forward, delivering a knee strike to his chest, sending him tumbling backwards into the wall. He hit it with such force that his shoulders caved in part of the drywall. As he clutched his chest, still struggling for breath from the chest strike, Rodriguez walked in, standing beside Sparks. The two of them looked down at the fallen man whimpering on the floor.
"My father is going to kill you both," he whined. "Not just kill, but torture. You're going to be begging for death for weeks before he grants it to you. And I'm going to be there for it. All of it."
Sparks glanced at Rodriguez.
"You have something to shut him up with?" she asked.
The taller man smirked and reached into his pocket, pulling out a hard plastic container. He popped it open to reveal a syringe filled with a cloudy liquid.
"Don't you dare!"
Angel cried when he saw it, eyes wild as Rodriguez knelt beside him.
"Don't you dare put that in me, you son of a b—"
He fell limp as Rodriguez jammed the needle into his leg, unconscious in a matter of seconds. Sparks nodded in awe.
"That's some fast-acting stuff you have there," she said.
"It's a proprietary blend I've perfected over the years," Rodriguez replied, tossing the syringe aside. "Knocks them out quick, but doesn't last terribly long. Of course, by the time they wake up, they're restrained, so it doesn't matter."
She smirked. "Speaking of," she said, "I can help with that."
She reached into her bag, pulling out a variety of BDSM gear, handcuffs, ankle and wrist restraints, and a bright pink ball gag. Rodriguez took a pair of the cuffs, donned with neon fur. "Do I even want to know why you have this?" he asked dryly.
"Apparently, whoever owned the house I'm staying in was a bit of a freak in the sheets," she said with a shrug. "So I borrowed some of their gear."
Rodriguez shook his head. "Well, they have good taste in colors," he said, examining the many shades of pink. "He is going to be really pissed off when he comes to."
"He's going to be even more pissed off when he sees Rogers coming in," Sparks added.
"My only regret is that I'm not going to be here to see it," Rodriguez replied with a sigh.
The redhead cocked her head. "Well, I don't know Rogers that well," she replied. "I get the sense he will gladly tell you all about it every chance he gets until the end of time."
Rodriguez smiled. "Going to be some fun dinner conversations if we pull this off," he said, and they began to bind Angel in his new, bright pink fate. Chapter 2. The sun set over the town of Fabens, and Leon stood in front of the satellite monitor. Sparks, Rufus, Trenton, Clara, and Jeff stood around him in a semicircle, armed to the teeth and ready for battle. The radio crackled to life on the table, and they all looked towards it. The interstate watch came through in a very convincing faux traffic reporter voice.
"This is your eye in the sky reporting from high atop the abandoned gas station overlooking Interstate 10, they declared. "Do you copy?"
The group shared a much-needed laugh, breaking the tension. Leon picked up the radio, still smiling. "Yeah, we're here, man," he replied. "What you got?"
"The horde is in sight,"
the watchman said. The brief moment of levity vanished, leaving the mood in the room somber once again. Even the hardened warriors had knots growing in the pits of their stomachs. Despite being through so much in their lives, it was unspoken that this would be their biggest challenge yet. "How soon?" Leon asked into the radio.
45 minutes at the most,"
the watchman replied. "Understood," Leon said. "Stay out of sight, and good luck."
10-4,
came the reply, and then the line went dead. Leon pocketed the walkie-talkie before reaching to the shelf above his desk, pulling down the giant military-grade sniper rifle from it.
"Okay, you all know your assignments,"
he said, turning around as he cradled the gun. "Stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and we'll get through this." Everyone stared at him, blinking at the strain in his voice. He shook his head and cracked a smile.
"Not buying it, huh?"
he asked, flashing back to Ethel. "Hey, it's not your fault we know what we're up against," Rufus drawled.
"This is true," Leon admitted. "In that case, allow me to be a little more realistic. Go fuck some shit up and take as many of those fuckers down with you."
The old man raised a fist.
"There you go. I can get behind that," he declared.
More laughter rippled through the group, though it was clear it was forced in to try to push out the fear. "So, girl," Rufus said, turning to Sparks, "you ready to go?" She furrowed her brow. "Go where?" she asked. "You don't honestly think I'm going to let you go set off that humdinger without me, are you?" he drawled. She immediately shook her head. "It's going to be a hell of a run, since we have to wait on those things to show up," she insisted. "It's going to be made a hell of a lot easier with me watching your back," he countered. "Now, if you want to keep arguing about me coming along, you can do it while we drive up there." Sparks took a deep breath, but couldn't stop herself from smiling. She reached out and gave his bicep a reassuring squeeze. She led the group towards the door. "Clara, hang back a minute," Leon called, and she paused, turning back to him as everyone else filed out. "What's up?" she asked. "There's something I wanted to tell you," he said. "I've given your assignment to someone else." She blinked at him, shaking her head. "What?" she demanded. "Why?" "Because you need to go meet up with Rogers," Leon explained. "He's at the house with the blue shutters near the hospital." Clara eyed him suspiciously. "Okay, what's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Rodriguez decided to make a power move to take over the Rivas cartel," he replied. "So Rogers is currently babysitting Angel." Clara's eyes blazed. She didn't say anything, simply turning around and bolting out the door. He'd better not have killed him yet, she thought as she tore towards the hospital. As the town got into position, Rufus and Sparks stopped their truck on the bridge leading to the north. The sun had almost completely vanished on the horizon, but there was just enough light for them to be able to see the horde marching towards them. They sat there, mesmerized by the moving mass. "Not that I'm going to live to be 100, Rufus finally said. "But if I did, I doubt I'll ever see anything that terrifying again in my life." Sparks smirked. "Don't be so sure," she replied. "There's always the possibility you could see me get truly pissed off at someone." Rufus chuckled. "This is true," he admitted. "I saw what you did to that prick Elijah." "Seems like a lifetime ago when that happened," she said with a sigh. "Well, better not be, because we still have a lot of living left to do," he said, taking her hand in his. She smiled softly at him. "Look at you, getting all upbeat," she said. "Not upbeat," he replied, shaking his head. "Just a war mentality. In my darkest days in the jungle, I would have to remind myself of that. I knew a lot of guys who thought it was all over and acted like it. Sad to say that most of them were right." "Well, we're not going to make that mistake, are we?" Sparks asked firmly. He grinned at her. "Hell no, we're not, girl," he agreed. "Come on, we should get set up," she said, and put the truck in gear. "Gotta park this thing at the shelter and walk back to the humdinger." "Yes, ma'am," he drawled, and they turned to speed off to their destination. Clara rushed towards the hospital, finding the house with the blue shutters, and tore up the front steps to the door. She tried the knob, but it was locked, so she banged on it with a closed fist instead. After several minutes of pounding, the door opened, and Rogers sighed at the sight of her. "Damn it, Leon," he muttered. "Oh no," Clara snapped, pointing a finger at him. "He did the right thing in telling me. Now, are you going to let me in?" He hesitated for a moment, and then stepped aside. She stormed in like a hurricane, looking around wildly. "Where is that motherfucker?" Upon entering the living room, she stopped short, gasping at the sight before her. Angel laid flat on his stomach, his wrists and ankles bound behind his back with fuzzy pink restraints in a hog tie. He sounded like he was spitting obscenities at her, but with the bubblegum-colored ball gag in his mouth, all that came out was muffled noise and drool. Clara's stunned silence broke as she burst into laughter, quickly moving from mirth to that of a supervillain. "So, yeah, Rogers said as he stepped up beside her, scratching the back of his head. I was still deciding on what to do with him. Clara stalked forward and kicked the bound Revis in the face, cracking his nose beneath her boot and sending a stream of blood across the carpet. Well, I mean, besides the obvious, Rogers continued. She turned to the detective.
Why haven't you killed him yet? She asked.
I wanted to make sure the cartel had completely left, he explained. And I need a zombie to bite him, just on the off chance one of them stumbles across his body. Gotta make it look like he died at their hands, not ours.
Clara crossed her arms. In your out-there hypothetical, she said, you think they'd do an autopsy?
I was going to make the bite on the face so they'd see it quickly, he replied, motioning to his own. So, probably not.
Good, she said, her eyes set in a fierce intensity, and stalked into the kitchen.
Silverware clanged together as she rummaged and then emerged moments later with an armful of blades. She dropped a pile of knives and a meat cleaver on the floor in front of Angel's face, and then knelt down, grabbing his hair and jerking his head up so he could see her, inches from him.
You should know that we have a couple of hours before the first zombie is going to reach us, she said, voice level and menacing. You should also know that I've spent every day since our first encounter thinking about what I would do if I had 5 minutes alone with you.
She pulled down the front of her shirt to show him his initial carved into her soft flesh.
Now, you see, my biggest dilemma in coming up with all of these ideas is that I couldn't fit them all into the 5-minute time frame.
She grinned, but there was no humor there, only malice.
Lucky for me, that didn't prevent me from continuing to dream. Now my biggest dilemma is deciding on what to do first.
Angel thrashed, screaming into his gag until he was red in the face. Clara finally grasped his jaw, squeezing his cheeks and forcing him to look at her.
If you keep that up, I'm going to replace your ball gag with something off of you.
He stopped moving, and she ran her tongue over her teeth at the sight of tears pricking the corners of his eyes.
Good, she cooed. Looks like you realize I'm not joking.
She patted him on the cheek before letting loose with a firm slap, and then got to her feet, picking up one of the butcher knives. She paced back and forth in front of the bound and trembling man a few times, and then paused when she spotted Rogers in her periphery.
I'm so sorry, she blurted, turning towards him. I let my hatred get the better of me. I know he killed your partner, so if there's anything you'd like to do, please, just say the word.
Rogers cocked his head. I'm content just watching you for the moment, he replied. If I can assist in any way, I'm happy to do so. She contemplated for a moment before raising a finger.
Is there anything to drink? She asked.
Just some bottled water, he replied.
I'll take one if you don't mind, she said sweetly. It's important to stay hydrated when exerting yourself.
With that, she knelt down and rolled Angel onto his side, slicing open his shirt with a knife. Rogers smirked and walked into the kitchen, taking a deep breath of bliss as Angel whimpered beneath Clara's ministrations. Chapter 3. The interstate watch guard leaned back against the edge of the roof, pulling a dark hoodie over his head to conceal himself. He looked towards the interstate, watching as the moonlight reflected on the constantly moving horde. The light wasn't quite bright enough for him to see the details in the rotten flesh-eaters, but it was enough for him to see what they were doing. The front edge of the horde walked right by the exit ramps, paying them no attention. For a brief moment the guard thought that maybe, just maybe, the town would be okay. This train of thought screeched to a halt within a couple of minutes as several zombies took notice of the ramps on both sides of the highway and pressed against the cars. There were 2 cars horizontally across each ramp, with a third bracing them from behind. At first, the handful of ghouls weren't enough to move it, but that quickly changed when their agitated moans attracted dozens of others to their cause. As the bulk of the horde continued marching down the interstate towards El Paso, the mini-hordes on either side of the road attempted their breakaway, pushing hard against the vehicles. When their numbers swelled from the dozens to the hundreds, the tires on the vehicles began to screech. The sound, while faint, was still loud enough for the guard to hear. His heart sank quickly when he realized the town was really in for a long night. He pulled out his walkie-talkie and ducked down, keeping the volume as low as it would go. "The horde has arrived," he murmured into the device. "They are pushing hard enough on the cars to get them to move. Everyone stand by." He sank low on the roof, staying completely out of sight, but also to stop himself from having to watch the proceedings below. The sound of the tires squealing on the pavement was more than enough doom and dread for him. This went on for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality it was only a few minutes. Finally the tires went silent, prompting him to sit up and peer down. The zombies had pushed through the car barricades and slowly made their way up the ramp towards the town and to the north of town. "They are through the barricades," he whispered into the radio. "The opening is not extreme, but there will be a steady stream of them for a while." He took a deep breath. "Good luck, everyone." He laid down on his back, setting the radio on his chest to muffle whatever sound might come through it. He stared up at the night sky, so clear without all of the light pollution, and listened to the shuffling feet heading past his post. Trenton, Leon, and Jeff stood in front of the command center, about half a mile from the ramp. They held metal pipes and all had machetes strapped to their belts. The moon, while nearly full, was still low on the horizon, which made for dim lighting conditions. Even with that, they could still make out movement coming down the road for them. The only thing standing in their way was 3 sets of barbed wire traps attached to cars that stretched out across the road. With each passing moment, the ghouls grew closer, and the moon grew a little higher, fully showing what they were facing. "That doesn't look daunting at all," Trenton breathed. Jeff shrugged. "We've faced worse," he replied. "True, but it wasn't on our doorstep," Trenton countered. The skinhead sighed. "Fair point." "Just remember, we don't have to beat them all," Leon said. "Just delay them long enough for the horde to pass." "Reminding me of my football days," Trenton joked. "Get a small lead in the 4th quarter and run out the clock." Jeff rolled his eyes. "Sounds like you had a shitty coach," he drawled. "My coach wanted to pound the hell out of the other team, regardless of how much time was left." "Well, we made state all 3 years I was on the team, and made it to the quarterfinals my senior year," Trenton shot back. "So he must have been doing something right." Jeff sighed. "We never had that kind of success," he admitted. "But we did beat our rivals 56-3 my senior year. Coach even called a timeout just before the game was over so we could kick another field goal. That was a fun night." "Well, if you wanted to beat the hell out of your opponent," Leon said, "you're going to have your fill tonight." He motioned towards the zombie horde, which now numbered easily in the hundreds. They were spread out over the entirety of the street, approaching the first barbed wire trap. The group waited, watching as the front edge of the corpses pressed into the wire. The light was just bright enough that the zombies could see the 3 men standing 50 yards away, which only intensified the moaning and thrashing. The weight behind them quickly grew, pushing their decrepit bodies through the jagged wire. Several zombies fell in 2 pieces, torsos hitting the ground and other creatures stepping up to take their place. This was short-lived, however, as the barbed wire quickly snapped under the intense pressure of the horde. "Was hoping that would have lasted a bit longer," Leon muttered. Jeff grinned. "That's what she said," he declared. "Really, man?" Leon asked, but he couldn't help the smile on his face as Trenton snickered. The skinhead shrugged. Humor is my coping mechanism. The trio watched as the horde continued to grow and pushed towards the next line of barbed wire. This time, however, their weight and momentum were too much for the trap to have much of an impact. It held for a good 30 seconds before it gave way, leaving only the one line left. "So much for round 2 lasting longer," Jeff said with a sigh. "As soon as they get through that third line," Leon said, "we start backing up and moving to the west once we hit the ditch. Trenton, you cross first. Jeff, you're next. Then the 2 of you come drag my old ass out of that ditch." Jeff cocked his head, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Seems like you might not have been the best volunteer for this job there, bud," he joked. "Nobody else available," Leon replied with a shrug. "Gotta step up." The skinhead nodded as they turned their attention back to the line of zombies pushing through the final barricade. As soon as it snapped, they headed back towards the drainage ditch, about 50 yards away. They kept pace with the zombies, not wanting to get too far ahead of them nor close the gap. The moon grew higher in the sky, making it easier for them to keep an eye on the battlefield. The moving mass kept its attention locked on the trio, moaning and flailing with excitement as they gave chase. "Fuck, man," Jeff grunted as he looked over his shoulder at the ghouls that stretched back as far as the eye could see. "There's going to be thousands of these things." "Just means we have to spread them out further," Leon replied. "Trenton, go." Trenton broke away from the group, jumping into the ditch. He rushed across to the other side, struggling to make it up the steep embankment. He was forced to grab onto some of the stakes in the ground to pull himself up and managed to do so without dislodging any of them. He turned around and immediately started yelling towards the zombies, hoping to pull them away from the main pack. His screams were successful, and a few dozen ghouls staggered away to follow him into the ditch. The creatures were less than graceful, most of them stumbling and falling face first into the ground as they stepped off of the road. It didn't take long for them to get back to their feet and continue their pursuit of the yelling man, but every second bought was a blessing. The screaming continued as the ghouls worked their way towards him. Trenton watched as the first zombie made contact with a spike. It moved forward, its roomy eyes locked on him, not even noticing the stake piercing its chest and pushing right through the rotten flesh. Within moments the creature was fully impaled, but continued to try to move. The zombie behind it met the same fate, both of them stuck tight like a rotten kebab. Trenton looked down as the scene replayed itself multiple times. The only exception was a ghoul that somehow managed to work its way in between some stakes and approach the top of the ditch. He took aim and brought his metal pipe down hard on the zombie's head, cracking it wide open. He surveyed the entirety of the ditch, full of dozens of ghouls. Many spikes had 2, 3, or even 4 zombies impaled on a single one. The pressure behind the creatures quickly built, and he could hear the creak of splintering wood. "Damn it, this isn't going to hold very long," he muttered, and took off down the side of the ditch towards where Jeff was pulling himself up. The 2 of them started yelling to continue to pull zombies off of the line still pursuing Leon. "You good?" Trenton asked. Jeff nodded. "Peachy," he replied brightly. They looked back towards the main road at the corpses stretching all the way back to the bridge. There were a significant number of them that hadn't followed alongside the ditch, instead pressing up against the barricade over the bridge. The duo watched in horror as the structure started to move under the intense weight of the horde. "Fuck," Jeff breathed. "Come on, we have to get Leon," Trenton urged. Both men took off, spotting their friend about 30 yards away in the ditch, struggling to climb up the other side. They slid to the edge and reached down to grab his hands as several ghouls fell into the ditch on the other side. "Really should have left this up to you two," Leon grunted as he clambered up beside them. The trio surveyed the ditch, full of hundreds of corpses, with hundreds more on the road stretching back as far as they could see. "Looks like we did our job, though," Leon added. Jeff shook his head. "Not good enough," he said. "What?" Leon asked. There's a whole mess of them back at the bridge, and the barricade is already starting to move, Trenton explained, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Leon shook his head. Christ, he groaned. This is going to come crashing down on us hard. They looked down the line at the sound of snapping wood, a handful of zombies managing to break free of the tracks and were pushing themselves up the other side, with a little help from the ghouls behind them. Come on, we have to get to the safe houses, Leon urged. Lay low with your teams and stay on your radios. I'll let you know when to move. The others nodded, and the three of them took off running into town, heading in the directions of their safe houses. Rogers sat by a cracked window, listening to the moans growing in volume from the far end of town. He glanced back at Clara, who was carving her friend's name into Angel's chest. His muffled screams sputtering around the ball gag wasn't enough to block the chorus of the hungry zombies invading the town. Clara put the last letter into Angel's flesh, before giving him a firm stab to put the dot over the I.
Not that you'll ever have to look at it in the mirror, she said with a sneer. But I'll sleep better knowing that you're branded with her name, you motherfucker.
He mumbled incoherent pleas around the gag, tears streaming down his face. Hey, Clara, shut him up for a minute, Rogers said from the window. She glared daggers at the bound man, and he immediately stopped making noise. Once the cocky cartel leader's son, now withered to nothing but a weeping sack of flesh, Rogers cupped a hand around his ear, emphasizing the sound of the ghouls moaning from the other side of town. You hear that, you son of a bitch? He asked as he hopped down from the windowsill. That's your end making its way to you. Not going to be long before you're a snack. Angel sobbed around the gag, pressing his forehead against the carpet as he wept. Clara stood up and headed towards the kitchen. We still have some time, Rogers called after her. You don't have to stop.
Oh, I know, she said back over her shoulder. I was just going to see if they had some lemon juice for his wounds.
The detective cracked a smile, nodding at her to continue. Deep down, he knew that this wasn't the healthiest thing for her to be doing. But who was he to tell her no? He was going to get his revenge for his partner's death by feeding Angel to the dead. Clara, however, was on a mission, not just for herself, not just for her friend, but for all the women Angel had tortured and killed over the years. Rogers approached the window as she came back in and took his seat in the sill to listen to the moans getting closer. Clara held up a bottle of lemon concentrate, wiggling it in front of Angel's wide, terrified eyes. As she unscrewed the cap and began to pour, this time her victim's cries were enough to drown out the horde. Sparks and Rufus sat inside the humdinger, in the back, in a padded area surrounded by insulated foam. They were side by side on the floor, legs stretched out with their backs against the door. It had been about 15 minutes since the first zombie had passed by them, and they continued to go at a steady pace. Despite the insulated padding, Rufus spoke in a low voice. "Sounds like lots of them, some bitches out there," he murmured. "Let's just hope we got the bulk of them, and not the town," Sparks replied with a soft sigh. The old man shook his head. "If they're getting this size of a crowd, those defenses are going to be toast," he mused.
"Just means your humdinger is going to have to work its magic," she said, looking up at him with a smile.
"Hell, it's given us this quiet moment together," he said, kissing the top of her head. "I think it's already working its magic." Sparks smiled and leaned against him, resting her cheek on his shoulder. Rufus had been with her every step of the way since the apocalypse had begun, and even now he was still by her side. The couple sat in silence together, listening as the horde grew and grew, walking by them outside the bus full of explosives. Chapter 4. Hammond, Whitaker, and Landry snuck around the side of a building a couple of blocks away from the site where Mathis was being held. Hammond was in front, peering through his night vision assault rifle scope towards the target. The moonlight was quite bright, making the image a bit washed out. Even though the power was out in the area, there were several lights on in the building. The faint buzz of a generator in the air. The front of the building was nondescript, with only a single guard standing outside in plain clothes. It was 3 stories tall and didn't take up too much space on the lot. If someone just drove by, they would assume it was an employee standing outside for a smoke break. "How's it looking, Sarge?" Landry asked quietly. The sergeant took a deep breath. "One out front," he replied, "but not seeing a whole lot of movement." "Makes sense," Whitaker replied. "If they are using it as a holding cell, they wouldn't want to draw attention to it." Hammond scanned the area a bit more, looking down the street on their side of things. He saw several buildings dotting the road, most of them office buildings. "Okay, Landry," the sergeant finally said. "I think if you work your way down the road behind us, you should be able to get a good position in one of the offices across from the target." "Pretty sure there are some houses on the next road," Landry agreed. "If you give me a few extra minutes, I should be able to find a ladder and get onto the roof." Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Why?" she asked. "There are trees everywhere, so it's not like you're going to get a great shot. Come on, bud, work smarter, not harder." "She's right," Hammond agreed. "Just get into one of the buildings and set up at the front." He pulled a small bag from his shoulder and handed it over. "This is the signal jammer. Once you turn it on, we won't be able to communicate. But as soon as we start firing, you take out anybody you see. I don't care who they are." Whitaker inclined her head. "Start with that guard out front," she suggested. "I get the sense we're going to have enough gun-toting assholes to deal with inside." "He'll never know what hit him," Landry promised. "Just wait for our signal," Hammond said. The private nodded sharply. "No problem, Sarge." He extended his fist, receiving a bump from both soldiers, and then took off into the darkness. "So, how you want to play this, Sarge?" Whitaker asked. He scanned the area around the building. There were bars on the side windows, and no other doors. "Windows are barred shut," he murmured. "We're going to have to go around to the back." She raised an eyebrow. "And if the door is locked?" she asked. Hammond simply smiled and pulled out a tiny pat of plastic explosive. "Then we'll make a grand entrance." "That should definitely let them know we're here," she replied dryly. "Which means we're weapons hot as soon as we cross that threshold," the sergeant continued. "According to the blueprints that Marcella got us, there are 3 rooms on either side of the main hall, with the stairs being in the center on the left from our vantage point. There are large panes of glass on the first floor that go into the office, so we should be able to do some running and gunning to get to the stairs." He looked through the scope again at the building, seeing that the room in the center of the top floor was illuminated, while the second floor was completely dark. "That top floor room has got to be where they're holding him. It's the only one there that's lit up." "Could be holding him in darkness," Whitaker countered. "True," he admitted. "But even if they are, I can guarantee the guards aren't sitting around in the dark. If we kill everybody and he's not there, it'll make life easier." Whitaker smirked. "You had me at kill everyone," she said. Hammond chuckled, and they checked their assault rifles and sidearms, as well as their blades. "I'm good," Whitaker said. He nodded. "Let's do it then." The duo made sure there wasn't any movement on the street before darting across it, taking cover beside another building. They then moved to the back and started working their way up the next street, guns at the ready in case of a guard. They worked their way up the corner of the street next to the target building, which had a wooden fence around the parking lot. When they reached the driveway, they peered around to find the back door. Hammond peeked and then quickly ducked back behind cover when he spotted 2 guards standing out back having a cigarette. He made hand signals to Whitaker, letting her know that there were 2 guards, and he was going to take the one on the left. She nodded in agreement, and they both got ready to move. With practiced ease and quick grace, both soldiers came around the corner, guns raised, racing towards the 2 guards who didn't even have guns in their hands. The moonlight gave the guards only a split second to react to the sight of the soldiers. One instinctively put his hands in the air, while the other one dropped his cigarette and fumbled for his sidearm. The soldiers were too quick, however, and Whitaker led with a straight kick, sending the fumbling guy back into the brick wall. When he hit the ground face first, she put her knee into the back of his neck and the barrel of her gun to his head. "You move, you die," she said, voice low and menacing. The pinned man nodded as much as he could with his range of movement to let her know he understood. Hammond grabbed the other guard by the shirt and shoved him back, pressing him against the wall while aiming his gun at his crotch. "You move, you lose something valuable," he warned. "Understand?" The scared guard nodded furiously. "Good," Hammond commended. "How many inside?"
10,
the guard stammered.
"Maybe more."
The sergeant shoved the gun against him, and the guard squeaked as the barrel crushed his jewels. "Maybe," Hammond warned.
"We're not allowed in one room on the top floor,"
the guard hissed.
"That's where they have the prisoner. I don't know how many are in there."
The sergeant cocked his head. "Fair enough," he replied. "You got a key for that door?" The guard nodded and pointed at his belt where a keyring hung. "Slowly," Hammond warned. As the man began to reach for the keys, Whitaker's prisoner began babbling in Spanish. "Whitaker," Hammond said, and she immediately drew her knife and stabbed him in the throat. The Spanish was quickly reduced to gargling as he drowned in his own blood. The sergeant cocked his head at his own captive, whose eyes were wide with fear. "Your keys?" he asked.
Please,
the guard begged as he unhooked the keys, holding them out.
"I have a fam—"
Whitaker cut him off with her blade, and his body slid to the ground, life draining from his body before he went limp. Hammond bent down and grabbed the keys. "Ready?" he asked. Whitaker nodded and got into position by the door, gun raised and ready to throw down. He slipped the key into the lock and turned it, pausing as the mechanism clicked open. He did a silent countdown and then threw open the door so that she could rush inside. The hallway that ran straight to the front door was dimly lit, with only a few camping lanterns in the windows of the offices providing light. As soon as she cleared the threshold, she spotted a guard sitting in a chair about 10 yards away. The man glanced up when the door opened, blinking boredly before realizing it wasn't his friend. He leapt to his feet, scrambling to get his weapon aimed, but Whitaker was faster, firing a 3-round burst into his chest. The sound of the gunfire was deafening inside the hallway, alerting others in the building. One man immediately emerged from an office 15 yards away, yelling at the noise. It appeared he'd thought it was a misfire until he took in the soldiers, but it was too late, and Whitaker took him down quickly. Her shots were a little more sporadic as he was further away, but 2 of the 3 bullets hit him in the face, blowing his head clean off. Before Hammond could even get inside, a torrent of gunfire erupted from the office the fallen guard was in. Bullets ripped through the walls and where the glass was, forcing both soldiers to hit the ground. The sergeant stayed down on one knee, opening fire through the drywall into the office where the gunfire was coming from. "Whitaker, move!" he bellowed. She crawled underneath his firing and quickly scrambled to her feet, diving into the next office, kitty corner from the one with the gunman. Once she was in position, Hammond stopped firing and crawled towards the next office on the right, which was just a few yards away. As he crawled, he looked up and spotted one of the gunmen coming out of the office ahead. Whitaker didn't hesitate, immediately opening fire and cutting the man down to size. Before he could even hit the ground, Whitaker was forced to duck back into the office for cover as several streams of bullets came her way through the drywall. She blindly returned fire for a moment to hold them at bay while Hammond got to his feet. The sergeant stayed low, rushing over to the far side of the office and looking through the glass into the next room, where the gunmen were. There were 2 of them pinned up against the far wall, firing blindly towards Whitaker. One of them had a radio in his hand, but didn't seem to be getting a response, grunting in frustration. Hammond took aim and fired a few 3-round bursts, shattering the glass and taking both men out. He stood his ground with his gun trained on them to make sure they were dead. "Clear!" he hollered. Whitaker stood up and aimed down the hallway to the front door about 30 yards away as Hammond joined her. A couple of guards came around the corner near the middle of the building from the left, about 15 yards away. The soldiers opened fire while ducking for cover. The bullets peppered the wall, missing both of their attackers. Before they could fire again, one of the guards popped out and sent a constant stream of bullets in their direction, while the other one sprinted down the hall towards the front door. "We got a runner!" Hammond bellowed and popped out, firing at the gunman. He managed to strike the enemy in the chest as Whittaker aimed at the runner, who was moving quickly towards the front door. She pulled the trigger, sending 3 rounds downrange, missing with 2 of them. The third bullet hit his arm, sending him lurching forward towards the front door, his weight and momentum causing the door to open. Before Whittaker could fire again, the man's head exploded as a single shot ripped through it. Both soldiers remained tense for a moment, waiting for another shoe to drop, but none did.
"Good to see Landry is at the top of his game," Whittaker said.
Hammond nodded. "We still have a lot to do, so let's hope he keeps it up," he said. They worked their way down the hallway, still keeping their guard up. The hallway to the stairwell was about 10 yards away, and Whittaker reached it first, quickly popping around the corner with her gun raised. There was nothing there but the corpse that Hammond had created. She opened her mouth to declare it clear, but Hammond slammed into her back, the 2 of them lurching forward and tripping over the corpse. As they hit the floor, gunshots rang out from the front of the building. Several streams of bullets ripped the drywall to shreds. "Motherfuckers were waiting on us," the sergeant growled.
"I'll clear the stairwell,"
Whittaker called, and scrambled for the door to the stairs, as Hammond fired back through the wall. She threw it open and jumped inside, the concrete blocks providing better cover than the cheap building material of the office walls. Once inside, she fired towards the group in the office so that Hammond could get moving. He paused, however, pulling out the small wad of plastic explosive and smacking it on the floor. He lit the short fuse on it before darting into the stairwell to join her. "First landing, hold them off," he said, and she hurried up the stairs, aiming upwards through the night vision scope in the pitch-black stairwell. The sergeant took up position on the landing overlooking the door, steadying himself, aiming and waiting. In his mind, he continued a countdown from 30, which was roughly how many seconds the fuse had. When he reached 10, he spotted the first gunman taking up position by the door and looking in. Hammond squeezed off a few shots, causing him to dart back behind the doorframe. 5, 4, 3, he silently counted, and popped off a couple more shots as the countdown finished to keep the men in the hallway. The explosion ripped through the lower level. Despite being only a small dab of plastic, it was quite powerful. The sound echoed loudly inside the stairwell, sending a collection of debris and body parts flying inside. Smoke poured in, illuminated by the fire, but there was no noise outside of the crackling of burning drywall.
"That got him,"
Whittaker said. Hammond nodded. "Let's go get our man," he said. She led them up the stairs, gun trained upwards, waiting to strike down anyone who crossed her path. When they got to the top, they paused at the door. Hammond got in position to open it just like before. This time, however, when he pulled on the door, several bullets ripped through it, forcing him to fall back. Whittaker managed to wedge her foot in between the door and the frame, quickly kicking it open, turning the corner and sending several 3-round bursts down the hallway. There was some return fire, but it missed everything as the door started to close on its own. Again, Whittaker used her foot to prop it open as the gunfire died down. Hammond crawled on his stomach, pulling himself down the stairs so that only his head and gun laid flat on the landing. "Now!" he hissed. She kicked the door open again, prompting gunfire from down the hall. They aimed high, however, expecting someone to be standing in front of it. Hammond used his brief window to aim with his night vision scope, seeing 2 men in a kneeling position halfway down the hall. With 2 quick trigger pulls, he put them both down. "We're clear," he said, getting to his feet. The soldiers burst through the door and began moving towards the office where they believed Mathis was being held. On this floor, the offices were enclosed, with no windows. However, there was a tiny bit of light coming from a crack in a door. They knelt down beside it, trying to get a look through the crack, but they couldn't see anything. Hammond did a silent countdown and then shoved the door open, and Whittaker darted inside. The office was a mess, desks overturned, papers scattered, and blood everywhere. It looked like it had been a torture chamber for quite some time.
"Whitaker,"
a familiar voice croaked, and she turned towards the corner, eyes widening.
"Mathis!"
she cried, and rushed over to a large dog cage in the corner. She grabbed the padlock on the outside, but it wouldn't budge.
"Shield your eyes,"
she instructed. He complied, and she aimed her gun, firing a round through the lock, destroying it. She tossed it aside and opened the cage, allowing Mathis to crawl out. He seemed fairly weak, but at least strong enough to climb out of his own power. She bent to help him up, but he waved her off.
"I'm good,"
he said hoarsely, getting to his feet. He was a bit wobbly, and she caught him before he toppled right over. The lighting was dim, but she could see numerous fresh wounds on his arms, neck, and face, and her blood boiled.
"Yeah, I know,"
he muttered when he caught her surveying his damage.
"I'm all kinds of pretty now. You can give me makeup tips later. Let's get out of here."
As they headed back to the door, a scream echoed from the darkness behind Hammond. He whipped around in time to face a skinny cartel member rushing him with a scalpel in his hand. He stabbed down, catching the sergeant in the arm. Hammond didn't flinch as the blade sliced through his flesh like butter, simply delivered an open palm strike to the man's nose, the crunch of his bones reverberating through the sergeant's hand. As his attacker stumbled backwards, Hammond looked around, snatching a claw hammer from the table next to him, flipping it around and slamming the prongs into the side of his enemy's head. The cartel member twitched for several moments as blood poured from his nose, finally dropping to the floor.
"You good?"
Whitaker asked.
"Yeah, I'm good,"
the sergeant replied, tossing the hammer aside.
"Let's get moving."
Whitaker hauled Mathis along, and Hammond shook his head, staring intently at the sniper.
"You're a tough son of a bitch, kid," he declared.
"Learned it from you, sir,"
Mathis croaked. Hammond's lip curled.
"You good to do some more damage?"
he asked.
"Do we have another shot?"
the private asked. Hammond nodded sharply.
"If you want it," he replied.
Mathis gently pushed Whitaker away, standing on his own 2 feet. It was clear he was in pain and weak, but his adrenaline and the thought of finishing what he'd failed to do last time seemed to give him the strength he needed to stand up straight.
"On your 6, sir,"
he declared. Hammond nodded and led them out the door, headed back for the stairwell. When they reached it, smoke poured out of the doorway.
"This place is going to burn down if we don't move it,"
the sergeant urged, and the trio raced down the stairs, getting to the bottom and peering out of the damage caused by the plastic explosive. There was a massive hole in the ground, and the walls around the blast were gone. A few corpses missing various body parts were strewn around, looking quite ragged.
"Pulling out all the stops to get me, huh?"
Mathis asked. Whitaker smirked. "You know Hammond. Any excuse to throw down," she quipped.
"Landry better not shoot me,"
the sergeant muttered as they approached the front door.
"I wouldn't want to spend the afterlife haunting his ass."
He slowly opened the door, sticking his gun out, stock first. He waved it around for a few seconds, hoping that Landry got the idea that it was them.
"Here goes nothing,"
he said with a sigh, and stepped out into the dark. When there was no gunshot, he breathed a sigh of relief.
"Come on, let's get moving," he said,
and led them across the street. Landry trotting from the other side to meet them.
"Holy hell, man,"
Landry said, eyes widening at the severity of his friend's injuries.
"They did a number on you."
Mathis grinned through the pain.
"Good to see you too,"
he said dryly.
"Come on, we can patch him up in the car,"
Hammond said.
"We have a little time to kill before we get another shot at Tiago."
The quartet glanced back at the building, where the fire had begun to spread, causing a bright glow on the first floor. They ran off towards the SUV to put distance between them and the building, before someone discovered the blaze. Chapter 5. 2 hours after the first zombie set foot in town, thousands of zombies had infiltrated every street in town, wandering aimlessly in search of food. The scout on top of the abandoned gas station by the interstate looked at his watch, seeing that another 15 minutes had passed since his last check. He peeled himself off of the roof and pulled his hoodie back a bit to remove the obstruction from his eyes. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, he had a glimmer of hope. The stream of zombies coming off of the interstate had ended. The creatures at the back of the pack had successfully pushed enough of the ghouls forward that the ones breaking away had been refocused on the road in front of them. The scout knew they still had a ton of issues to deal with, since there had been a constant stream of the walking corpses for over 2 hours, but at least the situation wasn't actively getting worse. He laid back down out of sight and pulled out his walkie-talkie, speaking low.
"Okay, everyone, listen up," he said. "New zombies coming off of the interstate have stopped. We aren't in the clear yet, though. The main horde is still marching by, so I wouldn't recommend using guns or explosives quite yet. As soon as they're past, I'll let you know. Good luck, and stay safe out there."
He put his walkie-talkie down on his chest and laid back on the roof, checking his watch again. Okay, another 14-minute break, he thought, and got comfortable as the chorus of moans continued in the distance. Jeff listened to the report from the interstate watch from his position in a house beside the school. He looked through the slits in the metal sheeting that had been affixed to the front windows for extra protection. The school was about 40 yards away, and from his vantage point he could see both the front and rear entrances, albeit not directly. The view across the 40 yards was terrifying, as there were about 500 ghouls wandering about, looking for something to become interested in. Jeff looked back across the living room to his team that was supposed to help him in case of trouble. Buck and Steve were 2 teenagers, barely 18, looking like they couldn't even run to the school without getting winded, let alone actually fighting for survival. Christ, if something goes wrong, these boys are going to cause more harm than good, he thought frantically. They might not be able to run now, but they sure as shit are going to be runners if they get bit. He pursed his lips, pondering what to do in the event of trouble. His radio clicked on and Leon's voice came through.
"Hey, Jeff, what's your status?"
The skinhead raised the device to his lips.
"Hanging tight, keeping watch," he replied. "You?"
"Pretty quiet down here on the west side," came the response. "A few dozen milling about, but nothing too crazy. How is the school looking?" Jeff shrugged. "I can see a few hundred from where I am, but most of them are in the field," he replied. "There is a small group of them around the front and back entrances, but nothing too concerning yet. I don't think they can get through the front door, but watch that back door closely," Leon instructed. "It's pretty weak, so a good enough sized crowd could get in." Jeff nodded. "Understood," he said. "Hoping it can hold for another hour, and we'll be out of this bullshit." "Same here," Leon replied with a sigh. "Stay frosty, and I'll be in touch."
"Sounds good,"
the skinhead replied, and put down the radio, focusing his attention back on the school's back door. It was difficult to see just in the moonlight, but the crowd around it appeared to have dispersed a bit. "That's odd," he murmured, squinting. He strained his eyes to see in the dimly lit conditions. The crowd suddenly became smaller, one by one, and then he realized they were vanishing into the building.
"Fuck, they got in."
"What?" Steve cried, leaping to his feet. "They're in the school? Let's go get 'em," Buck added, scrambling up beside his friend. Jeff raised a hand to calm them down.
"Settle down there, guys," he said firmly. "You two ain't going anywhere."
Steve gaped at him.
"But we were told to—" "I don't give a good goddamn what you were told to do," the skinhead cut in. "You two don't look like you could fight your way out of a wet paper bag, and I'll be goddamned if you're going out there with me."
The kids winced at his tone and sat back down on the couch. Buck scratched the back of his head. "Surely we can do something, though, sir," he said earnestly. Jeff looked back out the window at the hundreds of zombies spread out between him and the school. Even with as good of a fighter as he was, there wasn't any way he was going to be able to do much against a crowd that size. He racked his brain, trying to come up with something. Finally, it hit him. He turned back to the kids. "If zombies start banging on the front door, you boys ain't gonna start pissing yourselves, are you?" he asked. "We'll manage," Steve declared, raising his chin. "What do you need us to do?" Jeff waved them over. "Get over here," he said, and when they were standing next to him at the window, he turned to them. "Okay, when I tell you to, I want you to start making one hell of a ruckus. Doesn't have to be for long, just enough to make a hole through them for me to get through." Buck gaped at him. He stammered. "You're going out there?" "If I don't, those people in the school are going to have a bad day," the skinhead said firmly. "Now once you see me get to the field, you be as quiet as you can. The noise I make should pull them away from you, and you'll be safe. You ain't going to have a radio, so you'll just have to hang tight until morning when we start doing sweeps. You good with that?" Both young men nodded and got into position at the window. Jeff pulled out his walkie-talkie as he approached the back door. He peeked out and spotted a few zombies in the yard, but none closer than 10 yards. He raised the radio to his lips. "Leon, come in," he said. "Everything okay?" came the instant reply. Jeff took a deep breath. "Negative," he replied. "Some of those dead fucks are starting to get into the school." "Oh, God," Leon breathed. "Relax, I'm on it," the skinhead continued. "The door isn't wide open, so I should be able to pull enough of them away for us to run the clock out." He almost laughed at the fact he'd used Trenton's football terminology, but bit it back. "Where are you going to go?" Leon asked. Jeff grimaced. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted, "but hoping there is a vacant house on the other side of the field." "There should be a couple you can plow through," Leon replied. "Don't stop or try to reinforce it. Just go through it and start making your way to Trenton's house. He's 3 blocks to the west of the school. I just talked to him, and he said his street is fairly clear. You move quickly, and I'll let him know you're coming." Jeff nodded. "See you on the other side, Leon," he said, and then pocketed the radio and grabbed his metal pipe off of the counter. He took a moment, suppressing the "what the fuck are you doing?" thoughts running through his head. "All right," he called. "Make that noise." The 2 young men at the front of the house started smacking on the windows, making the glass and metal outside rattle. Within seconds, several nearby ghouls took notice and started coming their way, moaning loudly as they went. The noise they made set off a chain reaction, drawing dozens more towards the house. "They're coming!" Buck cried. "I'm out," Jeff called. "Come lock the door behind me." He threw open the door and darted outside, going straight for a zombie only a few yards away that had turned towards the noise at the house. The skinhead swung hard, clipping the creature in the side of the head and dropping it quickly. He scanned the yards, seeing 5 or 6 ghouls making their way to him from the other houses, but none were particularly close. He ran through the yard next to his house, lowering his shoulder and plowing through a zombie in that yard, before taking up position on the far side of the house. He got to the front and looked back towards the house, scanning the field towards the school. There were hundreds of zombies everywhere, most of whom were headed towards the reinforced house. There were already dozens of ghouls out front banging on the metal, which drove more creatures its way. "I gotta do this quick, or those kids are toast," Jeff muttered, and then noticed a slight opening across the field between the zombies, maybe 10 yards if he was lucky. Rather than think about it, the skinhead let his instincts take over and immediately broke from cover. He ran hard towards the field, cutting diagonally across it towards the school, which was about 70 or 80 yards away. As soon as he got across the side street and touched the sports field, he found himself between 2 large groups of zombies who had immediately forgotten about the house and started pursuing him. The line through the corpses began to close, and his heart rate tripled. This wasn't smart, he thought frantically, looking towards the field, seeing an opening about 10 yards away. There were several zombies in his way, but he couldn't lose momentum, so he turned and lowered his shoulder, hoping for the best. The first ghoul he encountered, he slammed into its arm, spinning it around and tumbling to the ground. The next one he met head-on, using his metal pipe as a battering ram and holding it sideways to catch it on the chest and drive it back. There were a few other ghouls directly behind it, and he used his zombie shield to knock them down before jumping over them. He clipped his foot on a clawing hang and stumbled a bit. He managed to stay on his feet, however, steadying himself before the final ghoul before the opening. With one arm, he swung hard, smacking the zombie in the side of the head and sending it flying away. He picked up the pace again, getting a good 10 yards away from the horde before pausing in the field. He looked at the school about 30 yards away, seeing the crowd by the door was already starting to diminish. He didn't know if it was because they got inside or had broken away to get to the house, but he couldn't dwell on what he couldn't change. Jeff put his fingers in his mouth and let out a deafening whistle that echoed throughout the night air. He scanned around him, watching the zombies get closer and closer, but there was a pretty clear path to the row of houses on the other side of the field. He let out several more whistles and yells, hoping to draw as much attention to himself as he could. Luckily, his tactic worked great, the majority of the dead coming away from the door to pursue him instead. Before taking off for cover, Jeff glanced back at the house where Buck and Steve were, relieved to see that the zombies were leaving them alone as well. The skinhead started running as the horde reached within a few yards of him. There were some creatures in front of him too, but they were spread out pretty thin. The run to the house was easy to cover safely, ducking and dodging. Jeff avoided enough outstretched arms to make it to one of the houses and smashed out the front window with his pipe. He hopped over the sill and into the living room before tearing to the back of the house. He paused at the back door before looking outside to make sure the coast was clear, and it was. He caught his breath and waited, listening to the moans at the front of the house. At the sound of a thump and steps on broken glass, he threw open the back door and rushed outside. To be safe and put distance between him and the agitated corpses, he ran back another block. There were zombies ahead, but they were sporadic. Knowing he couldn't risk one of them following him, he rushed up to the closest one and smacked it over the top of the head with his pipe, before retreating to the shadows beside a house. A few ghouls came out from beside the next one, attracted by the sound of the skull crack. They looked around for the source of the noise, but couldn't find the concealed man in the dark. Jeff waited patiently for them to hear the main horde moaning in the distance and wander off, and only then did he emerge from the shadows. He took off up to the main road, looking up towards the school, which was about 4 blocks up. His stomach sank at the sight of a significant number of zombies still out front.
Hope it isn't like that in the back, he thought bitterly. Fuck all I can do about it if there is.
He darted across the street, running up to the house across from him, and taking cover. He looked back from where he'd come, relieved to see that nothing had followed him. He moved quietly and carefully over the next few blocks before locating the house where Trenton was. About a dozen ghouls stood between him and the safe house. They'd better be looking for me, because this is going to have to be quick, he thought, and rushed out from cover. The first zombie he faced received a pipe to the face, and as the body crumpled, the other ghouls turned around and came his way. He tore towards them, lowering his shoulder and knocking them over. He executed them on the ground, knowing that if any one of the ghouls saw him rush inside the house, they could be in trouble. As he whacked the rotted heads on the street, Trenton rushed out of the house with 2 others. They spread out quickly, cracking skulls and stabbing foreheads. In a matter of moments, the area in front of the safe house was clear.
"Well, come on," Trenton hissed. "You waiting for an invitation?"
Jeff smirked and ran towards the house. The quartet rushed inside and closed the door, barricading it behind them. The skinhead leaned over, bracing his hands on his knees, breathing heavily.
"Damn, dude, you okay?"
Trenton asked, brow furrowing.
"Yeah,"
Jeff huffed.
"Just way more cardio than I wanted to do today."
Trenton chuckled. "Fair enough, brother," he said, patting his friend on the shoulder. "Fair enough." He pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Hey, Leon, come in," he said.
"Jeff make it okay?"
Leon replied.
Trenton nodded. "Yep, he's here and in one piece." "Was he able to pull them away from the school?"
Leon asked. The younger man glanced at Jeff, who was still doubled over, catching his breath. The skinhead managed to hold out a hand, giving him a thumbs up.
"Yeah, it worked,"
Trenton said into the radio.
"Good,"
Leon replied.
"I'm glad he's okay. Now we just have to hope he bought us enough time."
The room fell silent, outside of Jeff's labored breathing, everyone hoping beyond hope that he had. Rogers sat by the window, now several feet from it for safety. There were a handful of zombies in the yard, having made their way up to look for food. In the other room, the only sound were the muffled whimpers of the once fearsome Angel Rivas. Clara approached the window as Rogers continued to focus outside.
We have company?
She asked. The detective nodded. Yep, only a few, he replied. But as snipers like to say, we only need one. He stepped away from the window to go look into the living room. Angel lay on his side, still trussed up in the fuzzy pink BDSM gear, though much of it was now crimson from all the blood. The living room was a total mess, with a significant pool of blood on the carpet. Angel's shirt was in tatters, with various things carved into his flesh. His eyes, once dominating, were puffy and red from hours of crying.
So, is it about that time?
Clara asked. Rogers checked his watch, noting there was about a half hour before the humdinger was scheduled to go off. Yeah, I think it is, he said. I'm pretty sure I have enough time to put my own special brand of suffering on him.
Looking forward to seeing that,
she replied with a smirk. Well, come on then, the detective said, waving her over. Give me a hand with him.
Gladly,
Clara declared, and followed him back into the living room. Angel began to writhe around at the sight of the duo getting closer. They didn't talk. Simply each one grabbed one of his arms and dragged him across the sopping floor. As they went through the door, Rogers made sure to bonk his victim's head on the doorframe, just for good measure. Put him on his knees, he instructed, and they lifted and rotated the weeping man in front of the window. Rogers reached over and opened the glass up wide, and then gently tapped on the windowsill. Angel's face betrayed his confusion, but that quickly turned to panic at the sound of a hungry moan from outside. He tried to wriggle away from the window, but Rogers gripped the back of his shirt collar, holding him in place. The detective leaned down so that his mouth was a hair's breadth from the younger Revis's ear. "You hear that, you piece of shit?" he whispered. "You have a friend that wants to pay you a visit. Don't worry, it's not my partner Stevenson that you murdered, as much as I would love it to be. But I think this will be a nice substitute." A moment later, a zombie that looked to have once been a young blonde female in her 20s approached the window. It saw the trussed-up man and lunged forward, sticking its head through the opening. Rogers shoved Angel towards the gnashing teeth. "What's wrong?" he taunted. "You don't want to say hi?" It was a struggle. Despite his wounds, Angel fought for his life, putting everything he had into pushing back. But Rogers had the position and the strength to move him forward slowly. The zombie snapped at the air in anticipation of its meal. As the bound man was forced closer to it, his whimpers intensified, mixed in with panicked screams around the gag. Finally, it happened. Rogers got him close enough, and the zombie clamped its mouth onto Angel's nose. Even with the ball gag, the scream was quite loud, but then instantly muffled as blood poured down the back of his throat, causing him to cough and gag. When the zombie got a good bite, Rogers jerked Angel back quickly, ripping his nose clean off. He threw the thrashing man down onto the floor, and Clara drew her machete, stepping forward to stab the zombie in the face before closing the window. Rogers grabbed Angel by the restraints and dragged him back to the living room, shoving him against the wall. He knelt down and sneered right in his face, eyes blazing with rage. "No matter what you do, your life is over," he snarled. "You can't bargain your way out of this. You can't bribe or fight or have Daddy take care of this. With that bite, your fate is sealed. For a normal person, I would just put a round in their head and call it a day. But for you—" He shook his head, a smile curling his lips. "Oh no. For you, I'm going to sit and enjoy watching you come to terms with what just happened. Watch your eyes as panic sets in, knowing that you'll never see another sunrise, never have another shot of tequila, never feel a woman's touch again." He glanced over his shoulder at Clara and chuckled. "Well, maybe if you're nice, you can feel her boot in your gut again. But no promises." He patted Angel on the shoulder and stood up. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to fix myself a drink so I can properly enjoy watching you suffer." Angel let out another muffled scream at their backs, a combination of panic and anger and frustration.
"I'm impressed," Clara said as they entered the kitchen. Here I was thinking that inflicting physical pain was the way to go. You have some next-level mind games.
The detective chuckled. Stick with me. I'll teach you everything I know, he joked, and pulled out 2 glasses and a bottle of tequila from the cabinet, starting with a proper drink to watch a crime boss die to.
My kind of drink, Clara declared.
Zombies surrounded the bus, having been wandering by for hours. Sparks and Rufus had remained mostly silent, leaning against each other and enjoying the time. Sparks kept their walkie-talkie resting on her shoulder, with the volume turned as low as it could go, so they could wait for their signal. So, when we get through this, you going to be ready for the city life? Rufus murmured.
Sparks chuckled. City life? She asked. You think this is the city life?
Well, it's certainly bigger than where we have been living, he replied, and a couple times bigger than where you found my old ass.
She laughed. This is true, she agreed. But yeah, I think I can manage living here. Question is, are you going to be able to handle all the hustle and bustle of this metropolis?
Hell, girl. As long as we're together breaking heads, I'm good anywhere, he said, kissing the top of her head.
Sparks clapped a hand over her mouth as she burst into a fit of giggles, trying to keep the noise down.
He raised an eyebrow. I was being sincere there, girl, he said dryly.
I know, I'm sorry, she finally said when she got her laughter under control. I just had a thought about your old squad mates and what they would think about you becoming an old softy.
He chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, they would certainly have had a field day with that one, he admitted.
She snuggled back up against him, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. But before she could say anything, the radio clicked and she reached up to grab it.
The horde has passed, the interstate watchman said. They're half a mile or so up the road. Clear for the humdinger.
Sparks held down the button and said quietly, 10-4, we're lighting this puppy now. She put the radio away and got to her feet, holding a hand out for Rufus. Time to light up the night sky, she said with a grin. He pulled her down instead of getting up, giving her one more bruising kiss on the mouth to remind her what he was fighting for. She cupped his cheek and smiled, and then they got up together.
You check the escape route, Rufus said. I'll get the fuse ready.
Sparks peered out the front door, taking a knee by the first seat to stay out of sight. There was a steady stream of zombies wandering by, some of them almost right on the door. Just looking out, she could see a couple dozen stretched out 15 yards from the bus. The only saving grace was that they were somewhat spread out, with a yard or two between them. She looked over behind the driver's seat and grabbed 2 metal pipes they'd brought along with them, getting them ready.
How are we looking?
Rufus asked as he came up behind her. We're going to have to bust out, hard, she replied, shaking her head. But we should be able to push through. It's about 10-15 yards to the other side of them. He wrinkled his nose.
I would have thought they would have all been past us by now.
Sparks shrugged. Maybe they got hung up. Maybe they're just slow, she mused. Regardless, they're out there.
Well, okay then, Rufus said with a nod. You ready?
She took a deep breath. Ready as I'm ever going to be, she replied.
Hit the timer on your watch when I light this, he instructed.
Sparks nodded and held up her wrist as he pulled out his lighter. When he flicked it and touched the flame to the fuse, Sparks immediately began to fly, and he dropped it, running for the door. Sparks handed him a pipe and put her hand on the door lever. You run hard and you run fast, she instructed. Don't slow down until I do.
Lead the way, girl, he replied.
She took another deep breath and then flipped the door open. The noise gained the attention of a ghoul walking by that immediately took a pipe to the chest, staggering back. Sparks shoved the zombie hard, adjusting the trajectory a bit so that it fell to the right towards the back of the bus. Rufus jumped out next and swung, hitting a ghoul in the gut and sending it tumbling away. He quickly joined Sparks in running through a small group of corpses, all of which actively tried to grab them. They ducked and dodged and darted around outstretched hands while delivering a few jabs when they absolutely had to. The extra little bit of space allowed them to get through the mass of agitated, rotting flesh.
Sparks and Rufus sprinted up about 15 yards before slowing down. They glanced over their shoulders at the 40 or 50 zombies following them, moans filling the night air.
"Let's get to the shelter," Sparks urged. "If there are any of those things in the area, these moans are going to draw them to us."
They took off at a light jog, working their way the half-mile or so to the building. When they got to the fence, they cautiously entered the perimeter. Rufus had cleared the place out earlier, but with so many enemies wandering nearby, he didn't want to take the chance in case some had headed inside. Once they were fairly certain they were alone, they closed the fence up behind them. When they reached the building, it was still shut up tight. Inside, Sparks lit up a camping lamp and patted Rufus on the back as he huffed and puffed.
"You gonna make it there, old-timer?" she joked.
He grinned through his heavy breathing. "Oh yeah, never felt more alive," he drawled. The two explored the area for a moment, making doubly sure they were alone in there, which it turned out they were. Sparks grabbed a bottle of water and tossed it to him before grabbing one for herself. They sat in silence, enjoying the fact that they were alive, and basking in the pride of what they'd achieved. This was short-lived. "Hey, girl," Rufus said, brow furrowing. "Let me see your timer." She held out her wrist, and he took a deep breath, puffing out his cheeks on the exhale. "The humdinger should have gone up by now," he said, shaking his head. "Something's wrong."
"Calm down," Sparks said gently. "I'm sure the fuse is just taking an extra minute."
Rufus didn't calm down, instead paced back and forth, muttering to himself the steps he'd taken with the bomb. "Fuck, everything was set up perfectly," he groaned, stopping and running his hands over his head. "What the fuck could have happened?" Sparks's eyes widened, and then she bit her bottom lip hard, shaking her head. He glanced at her. "What is it?" he asked.
"Fucking Angel," she muttered.
"Angel?" Rufus demanded. "What the hell does he have to do with the humdinger?"
Sparks sighed heavily. "This morning, when Rodriguez came into town, he was angry that Angel went to the north instead of following him," she explained. "That son of a bitch must have done something to the humdinger."
"That goddamn motherfucking cocksucker!"
Rufus exploded, clenching his fists.
"If I ever see him again, I'm going to shove my hand down his throat, rip out his stomach, and feed it back to him."
Sparks nodded. "That can wait," she said, laying a hand over his and pulling his attention back to her. "How do we set off the humdinger?" He let out a whoosh of breath and then resumed pacing. Finally, he stopped and turned, rushing over to the duffel bag he'd left when they secured the building the first time. He rummaged around and pulled out a redneck rattler.
"Where did you get that from?"
Sparks asked, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged.
"Figured it might help with an escape if things went south," he explained. "Instead, it's going to save our asses."
"What do we need to do?" Sparks asked.
"Light it and throw it inside the bus," Rufus explained. "That open door will do just fine. This thing packs enough punch that it'll set that big bitch off."
She held out her hand.
"Then that's exactly what I'm going to do."
Chapter 6. Rufus blinked at her.
"Like motherfucking hell you're going out there," he said. "We're going out there."
"No, I'm going out there,"
Sparks countered, holding up a finger.
"Because I need you to stay here and keep those things occupied at the gate."
He bit his tongue, clenching his jaw as a million emotions ran over his face, and then begrudgingly set the rattler in her open hand.
"How do you want to do this?" he muttered.
"I'm going over the fence at the back, and we'll make a run for the bus," she explained. "I'm hoping that the light is dim enough that they won't be able to see me. But if it isn't, then I need you to keep them there. Their moans may have pulled back some that have already wandered by us, so I'm going to have my hands full."
Rufus swallowed hard and nodded.
"Okay, I'll do as you ask," he said, and then took her by the shoulders. "Now, you listen to me. You get this lit and thrown to the bus. If you can get it into the door, that's great, but just get it close and it'll do the trick. No unnecessary risks, you understand?"
She smiled and reached up to smooth the concern from his forehead.
"Don't worry, you aren't getting rid of me this easily," she promised.
He nodded and motioned for her to follow him out the door. She grabbed her metal pipe as she went, and as soon as they got outside, she ran to the back fence and tossed her weapon over. The fence was about 10 feet high, and as soon as the metal clattered to the ground, she got climbing. As she did, Rufus stood in front of the main gate, which had 40 or so zombies milling about. A dozen still moved up the road. They were making a hellish amount of noise, moaning and rattling the fence. He looked over their heads towards the humdinger, thankful that the ghouls from around it were heading this way.
"Yeah, come and get me, assholes,"
he bellowed, and followed the insult with a loud whistle, agitating them even more.
"You'd better be safe, girl,"
he muttered to himself in prayer. Sparks scaled the fence and hit the ground. She picked up her weapon and started running through the desert landscape towards the bus. The road was about 40 yards away, which was where all of the zombies were. She looked over and noticed Rufus doing a great job of keeping them occupied. As she ran towards the humdinger, she strained her eyes through the darkness for threats. When she reached a quarter mile from the bus, she made out several figures moving around in front of it. "Shit," she grunted quietly, and moved up a couple hundred more yards before taking a knee to conceal her position. She was dismayed to realize there were at least 50 zombies around the bus, drawn back by the moans of the other ghouls. They stretched out about 15 to 20 yards and moved across the edges of the dirt. Sparks loosened up her throwing arm, rotating it a few times. "I don't care if you dislocate your shoulder," she thought to herself. "You throw this thing as hard as you fucking can." She spent another moment psyching herself up before beginning her assault, walking slowly but deliberately towards the mob of undead. When she was 50 yards away, she lit up the fuse on the rattler and picked up the pace. The noise of her feet on the sand drew the attention of the zombies on the road. Within seconds, a dozen of them came towards her, arms outstretched and moaning loudly. She ran hard, getting closer than she'd ever wanted to be to the pack of ghouls headed her way. She waited until the last possible second to throw, giving it all she had. As soon as the rattler left her hand, she kicked back against the ground and backpedaled, her leg muscles screaming at the sudden motion. Despite the pain of pulling a few muscles, Sparks pushed through, jogging backwards and watching the bomb fly through the air. The fuse illuminated the bus as it tumbled, and her heart leapt at her true aim. The device bounced a yard away from the bus door, popping off of the ground and sailing into the open door into the bus. "Hell yeah!" she cried, and then immediately turned, running on her hobbled legs as her muscles protested. She glanced back at the few dozen zombies hot on her tail as she moved. She knew she could outrun them despite her burning legs, but it was the humdinger explosion that she needed to get away from. She pumped her legs as hard as she could, grunting with exertion as her muscles protested. She focused on the ground in front of her, making sure not to trip over any rocks in the darkness. The landscape suddenly lit up like it was high noon, quickly followed by a loud boom, the force of the blast sending her tumbling forward to the ground. She scrambled back to her feet, looking back at the gigantic fireball where the bus used to be. She let out a sigh of relief that she'd made it work, before focusing back on her immediate task of surviving. She ran hard towards the safe house, seeing the majority of the ghouls that had been in front of it were moving back towards the explosion. Faced with little other choice, she moved further into the desert, eventually reaching the back fence. She tossed her pipe over and started climbing up it, letting out a yelp at the pain in her overextended muscles.
"Come on, girl, hurry it up,"
Rufus cried as a few zombies peeled away from the back to stagger towards her. She let out a battle cry to psych herself up and finish the climb, flopping over the top in her exhaustion. Rufus managed to catch her in his arms, staggering back a bit before gently falling on his ass, still cradling her against him.
"God damn," he blurted. "That was one hell of a sight, wasn't it?"
She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Knocked me flat on my ass is what it did," she replied. "Hell of a job there, old-timer." They laughed as the zombies reached the fence, gnashing against it and rattling the chain link.
"Come on,"
Rufus said, leaning forward to plant her on the ground so they could get up.
"Let's get inside before they get too agitated."
Sparks leaned on him as they walked back to the safe house, their part of the mission completed. Leon startled when the humdinger went up, the windows rattling and the outside lit up despite being almost a mile away.
"Holy hell," he muttered. "Rufus doesn't disappoint."
He put his radio to his lips. "Okay, everyone, that was our one chance to end this thing," he said firmly. "Stay silent and out of sight until you hear from me. Leon out." He put the walkie-talkie away and motioned to his small team to move to the interior of the house, away from the windows. "Come on, guys, let's get comfortable," he said quietly. "Going to take a while for this place to clear out." As they moved out of view of the windows, he let out a deep sigh, trying to resist the urge to hope they'd survived the nightmare. On the south end of town, Rogers listened with glee to Leon's message before putting the radio down. He walked into the living room where Clara was nursing a drink, smiling at the suffering angel. His nose was mostly clotted, or at least what was left of his nose. Blood covered his face and the ground in front of him. "Leon just sent out a message that the humdinger went off," Rogers announced. She nodded, swallowing a sip of tequila.
"So that's what that sound was," she said. "Could feel it even here, so it must have been big."
"Yeah, Rufus knows what he's doing," Rogers agreed. She took another long sip before smiling at Angel.
"Well, if the zombies are fleeing the town, I guess that means only one thing," she said.
"Yep, everybody else has done their job," Rogers agreed. "Suppose we should finish ours up." Angel's eyes widened and he began his thrashing anew.
"Do you want to do the honors?"
Clara asked sweetly. Rogers shook his head. "Nah, I'm good," he replied, waving a hand. "Just watching the terror in his eyes as reality sets in is more than enough for me."
"That's generous of you,"
she replied and set down her glass, walking to the side table beside the couch. She ran a finger over the bloody instruments there, picking up a steak knife and turning it over in her hand, before setting it back down.
"You know,"
she mused,
"slitting his throat just seems too easy, don't you think?"
Rogers nodded, taking a seat to watch the show. "Yeah, and there's always the chance that the blood leaving his body quickly will provide him some relief," he agreed. They thought for a moment as their captive writhed and begged through his ball gag. "You could always use the meat tenderizer mallet," the detective suggested. Clara grinned darkly, picking up the mallet.
"I think my arm has enough strength left in it to crack his head open like a coconut," she said.
"If not, I can always jump in for a few swings," Rogers added.
"Teamwork, I like that,"
she said brightly, and tested the weight of the mallet, giving it a few practice swings, before stepping up to Angel.
"Now, don't you black out too quickly," she warned. "I want you to feel these."
Rogers couldn't make out the words babbling around the ball gag, but he could only assume the broken man was begging for mercy. Even if they weren't, he would spend the rest of his life comforting himself with the knowledge that they were. The muffled screams were loud, but quickly lost their intensity as Clara brought the mallet down for blow after blow. Soon the only sound in the room was metal on skull, over and over and over and over. Chapter 7. Hammond and Mathis knelt down beside the building that Leon marked on the map as the one most likely to have a sniper. Mathis was still moving a bit slow, but had his sniper rifle strapped to his back. The sergeant noticed his man was a bit woozy. "You going to make it?" he asked. "I can rest when we dust this motherfucker," Mathis growled. "Okay, when we get in there, we do it silently," Hammond said. "You let me lead and watch my back, clear?" The sniper nodded. "Clear." The sergeant checked his watch. "Okay, Landry and Whitaker should be in position soon," he said. "Let's do this." They moved towards the back entrance to the building, carefully looking through the glass to make sure the lobby was empty. Once they knew it was, Hammond worked on the lock. After several moments, he pried it open and led them inside, Knowing that they needed to keep the noise to a minimum, he had his handgun and knife drawn. Even with the sound restriction, he wanted to be prepared for anything. The two of them crossed the darkened lobby to the stairwell without any altercation. Working their way up to the top floor, it was just a few stories, and they silently opened the door to the work floor. It was a huge room full of cubicles, with large floor-to-ceiling windows on the exterior of the room. Hammond looked over the floor, seeing that one of the windows had been bashed out. He pointed it out to Mathis, who nodded, and the two of them went covert, moving silently through the cube farm. They paused at each intersection to check for guards, but found none. Finally, they reached the last aisle running along the windows and looked towards the broken one, which was about 15 yards up. Hammond motioned for Mathis to double back to the previous aisle and shadow him down, and once he was in position, the sergeant moved towards the shoot point. As he grew closer, he spotted a pair of legs sticking out about waist-high, as if the sniper was on a table aiming out of the building. He prepared to come around the corner to deliver a kill strike, but as he did, the hammer of a handgun clicked back close to his ear. Rather than put his hands up, he clicked the hammer back on his own gun, which was aimed at the sniper.
"You would be wise to drop your weapon,"
his attacker said in a level voice, and Hammond glanced over his shoulder at the man sitting on a desk with his back pressed up against a cubicle wall.
"Nah, I don't think so," the sergeant drawled. "If I'm going to go out, I'm gonna damn well take one of your men out with me."
His attacker laughed. "I have no problem with that," he said offhandedly. "That man is expendable." Hammond laughed in response, shaking his head. "What's so funny?" his attacker demanded. The sergeant shrugged.
"Pretty sure your boss sees you as expendable as well," he said.
The man sneered. "Probably, but that's a topic for another day." He extended his arm as if he were about to fire, but then froze in shock as a blade disappeared into his temple. Hammond nodded to Mathis, who stood behind the cubicle wall with a smile on his face, at the first stage of his revenge. The sergeant turned back to the sniper, who was looking over his shoulder at him. "You do realize that with one pull of this trigger, Tiago will go into hiding, and you'll be overwhelmed within minutes, don't you?" he asked. Hammond smirked.
"And you realize that in that few minutes we'll have plenty of time to cut off your balls and force-feed them to you, don't you?" he shot back. "Do you care about his well-being that much?"
The sniper seemed to weigh his options for a moment, and then removed his hand from the trigger. He slid back off of the table and got to his feet, raising his hands. He was tall and slender, with a face full of tattoos of various religious symbols. "I'm just following orders," he admitted. "I don't really care if he lives or dies. If I'm going to go out, it's not going to be chomping on my own balls." He stared into Hammond's eyes like a soldier, not like a victim. The sergeant cocked his head, impressed.
"You don't seem too upset about the end," he said.
"I got forced into this life, and to be honest, I'm tired of it," he explained. "It will be a welcome end." Hammond pursed his lips.
"What's your name?"
he asked. "I go by Azrael," the sniper replied.
Angel of Death,"
the sergeant murmured.
"I like it."
Azrael nodded. "I have earned that name many times over, I assure you," he said.
"Well, we have something in common, I suppose,"
Hammond replied. The sniper took a deep breath. "Based on your skill, I would assume we have much in common," he said. Hammond nodded at the compliment, and then raised an eyebrow.
"I have one more question for you," he said.
"Go for it," Azrael replied.
"Are you the forgiving kind?"
the sergeant asked. "I suppose so," the sniper replied with a shrug. "As long as the recipient is worth it."
"Good to hear that,"
Hammond said, and then immediately continued.
"Mathis!"
Mathis dove from the cubicle he'd been hiding in and slammed the butt of his rifle into the side of Azrael's head, knocking him out cold.
"Get him tied up,"
Hammond instructed, and the sniper ripped out a telephone cord from the desk next to him to secure the cartel member.
"What made you spare him?"
Mathis asked as he worked. Hammond took a deep breath.
A true zealot would have fired to warn his boss, regardless of the consequences to himself, he explained. He didn't. If we could earn a favor with one of these guys, figured it would be worthwhile to try as long as it doesn't impact the mission.
I guess if we're going to make friends with someone, Mathis added, the Angel of Death is a good way to go.
Hammond nodded.
This is true,
he agreed, and checked his watch.
Okay, you get in position. I need to take mine before Landry and Whitaker start some shit.
I'll be here waiting for your signal, Mathis said. They exchanged a fist bump before Hammond headed out of the building. The sniper inspected the sniper rifle on the desk, admiring its military quality.
Impressive,
he murmured, and out of respect for Azrael, he set it on the floor and ejected the mag. He set up his own rifle and then looked down at the bridge. The bright moonlight illuminated 3 figures in the middle of the bridge, looking down at the interstate below, where there were tens of thousands of zombies shuffling through town. On the other side of the bridge, Landry and Whitaker exited the SUV, guns drawn and ready to throw down, as they approached the target building. It was a 1-story warehouse with a row of windows on all sides. They approached from the rear, trying to stay out of sight. Landry motioned to Whitaker, who moved into the building while he covered her. She reached the side of the window, peeking into it. Inside were several camping lights illuminating the place. It was spread out fairly well, but the concentration of light was near the front. There appeared to be nearly a dozen heavily armed men standing about in a working bay. They were checking their weapons, surrounded by lanterns. One man stood by the window, watching the bridge. None of them were paying the rear any attention. Whitaker retreated to Landry.
"Dozen men, give or take, near the front of the building," she said quietly. "All attention towards the bridge."
"There a back entrance?" he murmured.
"Yeah, and given how careless these guys are acting, I would be surprised if it's locked," she replied.
Landry cocked his head.
"What are you thinking?" he asked.
"A little inside-outside maneuver?" she asked with a smirk.
"Molotov through the window, followed by suppressing fire from inside?"
He grinned.
"I like it," he agreed. "Rock, paper, scissors to see who goes inside?"
Whitaker reached into her bag and pulled out a bottle.
"Molotov beats all 3, she said.
"How the hell does fire beat rock?" he demanded.
She rolled her eyes. "Are you reaching into fire to grab a rock?"
"Well," he sighed, "no."
"Then I think we're done here," she replied and clapped him on the shoulder.
Landry sighed and readied his assault rifle, moving to the back door. He tried the knob and shook his head when it opened with no resistance. He couldn't believe how careless these men were being. Whitaker worked her way up the side of the building, hugging the wall to stay out of sight of the watcher inside. She reached the edge of the windows, which stretched out about 10 yards, and went from waist high to a few feet up. From her vantage point in the darkness, she could see the watchman looking towards the bridge intently. She broke her concentration for a moment to look over to the bridge herself, seeing Hammond in a standoff with Tiago and his 2 guards. She snapped back to the mission at hand, looking up at the watchman barking out orders. She quickly backed up several steps to give herself a little more darkness cover, pulled out a lighter, and set the Molotov ablaze before grabbing her handgun. She moved up to the window, and the watchman looked her way when the firelight caught his eye. Before he could react, she pulled the trigger several times, blowing his face in and shattering the window. Yells rose up from inside, and she threw the bottle in the window. As it crashed to the ground, flames engulfed the area. Numerous cartel members screamed in pain, several firing wildly towards the windows. Whitaker ducked back behind the concrete wall for cover, watching as what little remained of the glass was wiped out. She readied her assault rifle, putting the barrel on the ledge and opening fire. She sent blind 3-round bursts into the building, dispensing an entire magazine before reloading. Inside, the gunfire intensified as Landry moved up. He'd taken cover behind a large metal toolbox that was almost as big as he was. Bullets ricocheted off of it, and he peeked around the corner to take a shot. 2 men darted across the aisle to the other side of the building, trying to flank him. He fired several times, catching one of them in the side, but the other one was protected by the human shield.
"Fuck," Landry muttered.
He reloaded and then looked out, seeing 4 men still gunning for him. 3 were on Whitaker's side and 1 on the other. "You'd better still be alive, Whitaker," he huffed, and then focused all his attention on the man flanking him. It was dark over there, but he managed to catch a tool chest moving. He aimed carefully before pulling the trigger and was surprised that his nearly blind shot dropped a body. Being impressed with himself was short-lived, however, as the 3 remaining men were still firing at him. He took cover as the top portion of the toolbox took a significant amount of damage. Small pieces of shrapnel rained down on him. With Landry pinned down, Whitaker peeked in through the window, seeing a charred mass of bodies on the floor. A few were dead, but most writhed around in pain with burns over most of their bodies. She broke from cover and moved to the other side of the windows, looking back towards Landry and the 3 men still attacking him. She took aim and took one of them out in the back of the head. The second one didn't flinch, so focused on his task that he didn't notice his friend drop, and she put a bullet in his head as well. As blood and skull flew in every direction, splattering the final gunman, he turned around and opened fire on her. Landry broke cover and rushed into the center aisle, pulling the trigger and ending the man before he could shoot at Whitaker. Landry reached the burn pit, seeing several men charred but still moving. He quickly put a round in each of them, not to put them out of their misery, but to make sure none of them could take a shot. "Whitaker, you good?" he called.
"Yeah, you?"
she called back. "Got a little ringing in my ears from all the bullets on metal, but other than that, I'm good," he replied. She laughed.
"Well, if you don't have tinnitus by now, you aren't doing it right," she declared. "Now come on, we gotta go back up Hammond."
Hammond walked out from the building he'd left Mathis in and sauntered straight up to Tiago, his assault rifle aimed at him. The Rivas cartel leader had his back turned, staring out over the horde of zombies marching through town. But when the sergeant was 15 yards away, he began to speak.
"You should take time to stop and appreciate the sight before you," he declared. "We are some of the lucky few in human history to ever witness something like this. And in a few minutes I'm going to be the only one who's going to be alive to remember it," Hammond replied. "So why don't you go ahead and turn around?"
Tiago and his guards complied, his gunmen holding their assault rifles at the ground but with their fingers still on the trigger. The leader stood in the middle, his facial wound still present and prominent, staring at the sergeant with his chin raised.
"So, Rodriguez did betray me," the cartel leader said icily. "Does not surprise me. I always feared he had a weak stomach when it came to civilians. Answer me this, though. Did he help you give me my scars?"
he asked, motioning to his face.
"Indirectly," Hammond replied. "He told us where to go, but we did the heavy lifting."
Tiago nodded.
"Just as I figured," he said. "I'm going to have fun with him after I am through with you."
The guards began to raise their weapons, but Hammond leaned forward, and they stopped.
"I'll mow all 3 of you down before you can get those barrels past dick level," he warned. "So why don't you just calm down?"
Tiago smirked, waving between them to keep their guns low.
"Surely you don't think I would be out here with only these 2, now would you?"
he asked with a sneer very much like his son's. Just as he said that, gunfire erupted from the warehouse on the other side of the bridge, as Whitaker and Landry's assault began.
"Nope,"
Hammond said brightly.
"We figured you had some watching your back."
The gunfire intensified, and smoke began to rise from the building.
"No matter,"
Tiago said, though his voice sounded a little concerned.
"I have other ways of dealing with you."
He smugly folded his arms, jutting out his chin. His smugness quickly drained from his face when a shot didn't ring out, and Hammond laughed.
"I don't think you did your signal right," he said. "Let me try."
He raised his non-trigger finger in the air, pointing to the right. Almost immediately a gunshot echoed, and the guard on the right had no time to react before a bullet ripped through his throat, taking his head clean off. Both Tiago and the other guard stood stock still for a moment in shock, blinking at the crumpled body. The guard raised his gun, and then another shot rang out, blowing his forehead open, and leaving the cartel leader alone on the bridge. His smugness was completely gone, replaced with abject fear.
"Looks like you were all out of cards to play,"
Hammond said, taking a step towards his enemy.
"Are you sure?"
Tiago asked, voice shaking. Yeah, he's sure, Whitaker said, walking up with Landry at her side, both pointing their guns at the soon-to-be ex-cartel leader.
"Seems as though you have counted all of my moves," Tiago said. "However—"
He reached into his jacket and pulled out a finely made 12-inch bladed knife, brandishing it proudly.
"Let's see if you can fight like a real man."
Hammond rolled his eyes, slinging his assault rifle over his shoulder.
"Bold move, thinking that you can take down someone like—"
A gunshot cracked, and Tiago's knee exploded, sending him to the ground, screaming in pain.
"What the hell, Landry?"
the sergeant asked, turning to his companion. The private shrugged. What? He asked innocently. I was told to work smarter, not harder. Whitaker scoffed, and Hammond rubbed his forehead, chuckling. So come on, Landry continued. Let's throw this motherfucker overboard and get back to town. I'm ready for a drink and some R&R. Hammond shrugged and motioned for the two of them to help him. He grabbed Tiago's arms while the others each took a leg.
"No!"
Tiago screamed.
"I'll give you whatever you want!"
He thrashed in their arms, but it was no use.
"Power! Money! Women!"
Hey, Landry? Whitaker asked casually. Yeah? He asked. I bet you $10 that I can make a cartel leader fly, she drawled. Make it 20 and you're on, he replied with a grin. Whitaker looked Tiago dead in the eyes. Only thing I want from you is your cooperation in winning $20 for my friend here, she said. His eyes went wild at the realization that everything he'd ever acquired in life meant nothing. The soldiers set him on the shoulder of the bridge, and he scrabbled at the edge to try to hold himself there. Whitaker drew her knife and sliced off one of his fingers, prompting him to jerk his hands back. Then they pushed. Tiago Riva screamed all the way down, free-falling to the marching horde of zombies below. The trio watched as he landed on top of several corpses, crumpling them to the ground. The fall didn't kill him, cushioned by rotting flesh, and he continued to shriek as the ghouls converged on him and tore into his flesh. This went on for nearly a full minute, and his screams finally faded as his strength left him. Soon there wasn't so much as a torso left, just a few scattered body parts being picked clean off its flesh. The trio nodded in approval of their job well done, and Hammond swiped his palms against each other.
"Landry, go get the car," he instructed. "Let's get the fuck out of here."
"Yes, sir," Landry replied brightly, and jogged off as Hammond waved for Mathis to come down to join them. The sniper, happily having watched Tiago get eaten through his scope, sat up and packed up his rifle. As he turned to leave, he heard Azrael shifting and groaning as he woke up. Mathis knelt down in front of him. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your head," he said. "Just couldn't risk you interfering."
"Why did you let me live?"
Azrael asked. Mathis jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "My sergeant thinks you were worth sparing because you weren't a zealot," he explained.
"And what do you think?"
the bound man asked. Mathis pointed to his face. "I think men you are in league with did this to me," he said. "But I also think that if we're going to survive this apocalypse, having a few friends is necessary. I don't know if he's right. All I can do is hope you are of the same mindset." He stood up. "Your gun is in the next cubicle, just like you left it. Good luck to you, and I hope you find what you are looking for in this life." As he left, Azrael called out, "Soldier!" Mathis turned around and stared at him. "I'll be seeing you around," the bound man said, and gave him what seemed like a friendly nod. Mathis nodded back and left, trying not to dwell on the situation too much, making his way back to the others to head home. Chapter 8 The sun rose over the battle-torn town of Fabens. Most of the zombies had wandered to the north, attracted by the humdinger explosion. Leon emerged from hiding, stepping out into the neighborhood street. There were a few straggler ghouls, having gotten caught up in trees and fences. Jeff and Trenton came around the corner a block up with metal pipes in hand, the former delivering a kill shot to one impaled on a branch. "Don't worry, Leon," the skinhead called. "We're getting it cleaned up." "There are a lot of them?" Leon asked. Jeff shook his head. "Just a handful," he replied. "We'll get 'em easy." "And the school?" Leon asked. "About 15 of them in the gym," the skinhead replied. "But they didn't make it any further." "That's a relief," Leon said, letting out a deep whoosh of breath. "I'm going to head up to the command center, see if I can get a bird's-eye view on things." Jeff saluted him before going back to his killing duty. Leon wandered towards the command center, hitting the main road. He gasped at the sight of the barricade on the bridge, or rather, what was left of it. The weight of the zombies had completely dislodged it, sending most of it over the edge, into the drainage ditch. As he approached the bridge, he looked down at several dozen ghouls still impaled and unable to move. A few citizens waved at him from the edge of the ditch, keeping a close eye on the dead with blunt weapons in hand. "Don't worry, Mr. Leon," Buck called, puffing out his chest. "We're keeping a good watch on them." Leon nodded. "Unless one of those things breaks free, you don't take a shot at them," he instructed firmly. "Wait for Jeff." "Yes, sir, we will," Buck replied. Leon nodded and continued on to the command center. Out front, torsos and legs lay strewn everywhere from the barbed wire traps. Clara walked around with a stake, impaling some of the bodies in the head to make sure they were dead. "You're looking energetic this morning," Leon said as he approached. She shook her head. "Why shouldn't I be?" she asked, eyes bright. "That was the most fun I've had in years." "I take it your mission was a success?" he asked. "Very much so," she replied, beaming. He cocked a brow. "And the body?" "Kindling," she declared. "That's my girl," he said with a grin. "Rogers is waiting inside for you," she said, motioning to the door. He nodded, but before he could head inside, 2 vehicles approached, honking loudly. They pulled up, and sparks popped out of the driver's seat of the lead one, shooting him a grin. "Look who we found on our way back to town," she said as Rufus got out of the passenger's seat. Leon looked past them as Hammond and his crew emerged from the second SUV. He rushed up to them, hugging the sergeant and clapping Mathis on the back, grinning from ear to ear. He took a deep breath. "Is he 100% zombie chow?" Hammond declared. Leon gave him a high five. "In that case, I have a very expensive bottle of tequila we're opening tonight." He looked over at Whitaker to congratulate her, but she was staring past him at the doorway to the command center. "Excuse me, gents," she said, and Leon turned to see Rogers in the doorway before the soldier was on him. The others began to hoot and holler as they kissed. "Come on, man. You can do better than that," Leon taunted. Landry cupped a hand around his mouth. "Yeah, Whitaker, give him some tongue." The two didn't break their union, simply extended their hands, each giving the group a middle finger as they continued to suck face. Leon laughed. "Come on, let's get inside," he said. "Satellite should be up any minute." Landry bumped Whitaker on the way by, and she pulled back from Rogers, smirking up at his dazed face with a wink. She took his hand and they trailed inside last, clustering around the monitor with the others. Ethel approached with a tray of steaming mugs, and Leon gaped at her. "Ethel, do you ever rest?" he asked. "Not on a day like this," she quipped. "We're having a big dinner tonight, just so everyone knows." The group nodded and took their mugs, smiling and thanking her. Leon sat down in his chair and punched up the satellite. First up was Fabens. He zoomed in and panned around, only seeing a small handful of zombies roaming the streets. "What about the north?" Rufus asked. Leon adjusted his camera, stopping over the crater the humdinger had made. Everyone let out an impressed whistle, as the crater was about 20 yards wide and scorched the earth.
Jesus Christ. I'm sure surprised we didn't hear that in El Paso, Hammond said, shaking his head.
Rufus grinned.
Thank you. I'm quite proud of it.
Leon continued scanning, moving the camera several miles to the north. They saw a large pack of several thousand ghouls, all of them continuing northward. "I'll keep an eye on them," he said, "but it looks like it worked."
"Before we run out of time, check the El Paso group," the sergeant said, leaning forward.
Leon scrolled over to the tail end of the zombie horde. It had cleared El Paso, wandering into the desert west of town with nothing but open road ahead of them. "Looks like they're out of our lives," he said, and everyone let out celebratory yells. Various high fives and hugs were given, coffee sloshing around everywhere. Leon swiveled around and stood out of his seat. "I know you all sacrificed to get this moment, but I can't thank you all enough," he said sincerely. "You all saved this town in more ways than one. No more zombie horde, no more angel, and no more El Guapo forcing us to risk life and limb just so he can get drunk. Today, we officially begin rebuilding our lives." The celebration kicked into gear, mugs clinking, and then the interstate watch air horn went off, signaling an approaching vehicle. Everyone filed outside, including Rogers, since they expected it to be Rodriguez. The SUV idled for a moment before Marcella stepped out.
"Marcella!"
Hammond exclaimed, walking forward to greet her. Leon and the rest of the group seemed confused until Whitaker turned and explained. "She was our safe house contact, friend of Rodriguez."
"Is everything okay?"
the sergeant asked as Marcella approached him.
"For the moment, yes," she replied. "Word is spreading that Tiago is dead and that Angel is missing. Rodriguez has seized power and a lot of support amongst the men. However, there are some who feel as though he can't be trusted. They will remain quiet for now, but this is a problem that will need to be dealt with sooner rather than later."
"We understand," Hammond said. "You stood by us, and we'll stand by you. When you find something actionable, we'll be ready."
She nodded and smiled.
"Thank you," she said. "Rodriguez will be in touch soon, as will I."
She got back into her vehicle and sped off, leaving the group in a more somber mood than before she'd arrived. Rogers looked at his watch and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Okay, who had 6.5 minutes from the time we celebrated the end of the conflict to getting pulled into the middle of a cartel gang war?" Leon playfully raised his hand, and the group shared a laugh.
"Rogers is right," Hammond said. "But that's another problem for another day. Today, we celebrate our victory."
The group let out a cheer before heading back into the command center. The week had been exhausting, but they had survived. As always in the apocalypse, however, another storm cloud was on the horizon. The end. Up next, the action shifts back to the Low Country as the survivors do battle against the undead and the villainous QXR group in Low Country, Part 7. Coming soon. The second-month series continues as Captain Kersey leads a daring mission to Boise, in Idaho, Part 1.